fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. We got Mr. John Copenhaver. You're on the road to Nebraska?
I am. I'm in Nebraska. I teach at an MFA program at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. It's low residency, so I still live in Richmond, Virginia, but I come out here twice a year to teach. Actually, I love it. It's great. It's a great program, and I love the students, and I love my fellow faculty mentors. So it's a happy place, this particular little happy spot of Nebraska.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, it's such a beautiful state. So wonderful. And speaking of beautiful, we've got a great writer with us today, and he's got a new book out. The new book is called American Scare, and it's Florida's hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives. So we've got Mr. Robert W. Fieseler.
Hi. Hello. Happy to be here.
Well, there you go. How have you been lately? How's everything going for you in life?
It's going well. I'm in New Orleans right now. It's mega hot. But I've been touring a ton. So I've been sort of ducking out of New Orleans in its sort of prime humidity punches you at the airport when you land sort of situation. So I've been touring American Scare around the country, mostly East Coast, since the book launched on the 17th of July, and it's been tremendous. Especially I've been hanging with a lot of some major queer historians of this country have been coming out to help me celebrate the launch of the book. So Michael Bronski, the famous Harvard professor who wrote A Queer History of the United States, which any queer historian who's worth their salt has read that book. And so I met Mr. Bronski, and he's delightful. I hung out with David Johnson, who wrote the book The Lavender Scare, which the research of which I based a lot of my book, American Scare, off of. And he was delightful, gracious. So it's just been kind of a love fest, which is a nice way for a book tour to go.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, did you get to hang with John Copenhaver as well? I hear he's pretty nice.
We have not, but I'm so excited to chat about this book because my recent book is set in the Lavender Scare and, circling this time period that you've done deep research on. So I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah, it's important. Yeah. We're in a time right now that's being driven by these deeper historical currents that have to do with a lot of the messed up stuff that got broken and never fixed from the 50s and 60s. And the news cycle you see is chasing its tail. Each headline eats the next. So I'm glad we can dive into some of this deeper current stuff.
Yeah. Are you worried about us going into this sort of type of society again?
Yeah. I mean, reading in-depth Southern Red Scare documents for my book American Scare, which was basically Florida Red Scare documents, this largely forgotten inquisition called the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, or it was also sometimes called the Johns Committee, that for 9 years from 1956 to 1965 held residents of the state of Florida ransom to the extrajudicial whims of these white men that could call anyone they didn't like, black integrationists trying to create integrated schools, charismatic teachers that taught Salinger, closeted queer employees of the state. They could call them communists and enemies of the people and ruin their reputations just based off accusation. And so I've been in the midst of that sort of studying a hysteria society in the 50s and 60s for 6 years has eerily gone beyond the I'm seeing historic parallel stage. And it's taken me into the realm where I think we're experiencing another Red Scare, the first of the 21st century, I think, which is exposing, I think, for many people, this would be helpful, what actually a Red Scare is, which it has nothing to do with communism. That was just the hot button word of the 60s. So what it is about arch conservatives abusing the people's power to target small groups so as to enforce a new behavioral hegemony. It's the totalitarian impulse within the American radical conservative mindset. And back then, the hot button word or the thing that you could call someone to ruin their reputation was communist. Now we have a bunch of other words. You could call you terrorist, could call you gang member, subversive, and they could call you enemy of the people. They could call you groomer. But so I see the last Red Scare, when it ended, I think people were convinced that in the Eisenhower years that this could never happen again. McCarthyism could never happen again. And it has. We're living it, and now we need to learn how to deal with it.
Right. Yeah. And so quite often, I guess, under that title of Red Scare or being called a commie, they blamed all minority groups as being part of it, right? Like homosexuals or blacks and stuff like that. And when you protested or did some sort of display of something, it was considered to be inflated or caused by communists.
Correct. So they used it in the most unscientific, unintellectual way possible, where a communist, they could say a black integrationist leader like Martin Luther King was a communist because conservatives read somewhere that Marx wanted the unification of the races so that the proletariat could rise up. And so they would use this excuse to persecute throughout the South the NAACP and other integration organizations. And they claimed that because Marx and the Soviets wanted to destroy the American family from within, that's why they could persecute the homosexuals. Because they said that it was a communist or Soviet plot to turn more men queer, and they used it in a negative sense then, so that basically American society collapsed from within before the first Soviet boot set foot on an American beach. It's amazing how crazy and ad hoc and provisional it sounds to us, and yet back then those arguments seemed valid because of genuinely hyped panic that allowed for basically white groups that viewed themselves as social innocents to purge other members of a society that they felt represented because their leaders had told them this genuine social dangers. When really all that these in the South, once they got a hold of the word communist, they realized they could use this to preserve segregation, basically the social and economic apartheid system that allowed even the most mediocre white to benefit tremendously financially, sitting on the heavy end of a scale of the system. There was no separate, but equal. It was just separate and unequal. And so they could utilize the word communist, call anyone that term, and preserve the segregated system post Brown v. Board of Education, post all of the 1950s and 1960s Supreme Court decisions, 1 year, 1 month, 1 day longer, because that was the way. It's very hard to give up a society in which you have such a tremendous advantage. But people don't know about this. They think Red Scare, they think it has to do with stuff that happened in Washington, D.C., Senator Joseph McCarthy, HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee in the House, and they don't realize that the Red Scare caught a second and more brutal wind among southern states that were struggling to figure out how are we going to stymie the efforts towards integration and the breakdown of apartheid.
Yeah. I thought Red Scare was the type of lipstick people were going to start wearing. But how did you decide to narrate the story? How did you do that? How did you bring the story alive?
Well, I'm a narrative historian, so I wanted to do it using scene work, which would mean I would find historical figures in the past who I would portray in profile settings, and I would set in significant action, and ideally, and then I would play out for the reader what was happening to them in ways that was emblematic of the way that the history was progressing. I did that in my first book. That's the style of history I like. I did that in my first book, Tinderbox, which was about a notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar in 1973 New Orleans that claimed 32 lives. So many of the major figures were people that were going to be in the bar at the significant place, at the significant time when the fire happens, and the narrative consequences of that. That's history, but that's also, when you connect to character, you're bypassing the front door of ideology where most ideas don't get through for people, and you're taking a side door into the human heart where actually a lot more change making can occur. So I wanted to do that for I like books like that. So I wanted to do that for American Scare. I wanted to make, in the way that I'd made New Orleans a major character in Tinderbox, I wanted to make the state of post-World War II, this schizophrenic state of Florida. There's this new Florida and old Florida and all the crazy stuff that was happening in this boom state that was run by the most old-school, corrupt Southern government. I wanted to make that a character, too. So I sold the book through. I thought I would be able to find, get a hold of the records, get a hold of the transcripts, then that'll help me decide who my major figures were going to be, and then I'm going to write scenes about them. And I walked into the state archives at Tallahassee, probably the only gay guy ever excited to go to Tallahassee, Florida, to try to get the Johns Committee records, and I found that they were all mutilated to all get out. The state of Florida had sealed them for years, then censored them heavily upon release, removed the name of every victim from every transcription, every state document, even meeting minutes. And I panicked. I didn't know what I was going to do. Because have you ever talked yourself into a room and then you're like, oh, I don't know if I could do everything I just promised here. So I come from a journalistic background, so they teach you how to zig and zag. So I went and I saw who is another person who's researched this topic before me. I found that there was the first Johns Committee scholar was a woman named Bonnie Stark. She was a master's degree student at the University of South Florida who'd written a thesis in 1985 called McCarthyism in Florida. I went and I found it on some online JSTOR type thing, read it, and it's solid. It was amazing. And also, she had interviewed some of the major Florida perpetrators who were part of the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee who'd gone after NAACP leaders, gone after closeted queers and professors in various places. And she'd gotten these people to talk extemporaneously. Like, she'd been like, tell me more, sir. And I went after that guy, like that kind of thing. So I was like, I gotta see if she has these transcripts. So I reached out to her, and she scheduled a Zoom meeting, and she told me, then she went on my website, and she sort of gave me basically an audition through basically reading all my stuff. And then she told me in our first meeting, she goes, actually, I have the secret second set of records. I got them in the midst of the 1990s documents release. They're not as censored as the ones you're seeing in the state archive. I've been lugging these things around for years, and I want to give them to you. And I cried. I was just like, this doesn't happen. This was like I was getting access to a war room of materials. It was document find. And what criminologists would call an orgy of evidence. And it was going to be mine exclusively for the duration of me writing this book. And I knew when she told me this that I would be able to write the narrative book involving the players who were hurt by the Johns Committee, naming the victims, saying what happened to their lives, etc. Also naming the perpetrators, saying what happened to their life, all that. Through these 21 banker's boxes, some tens of thousands of documents. My husband was going to murder me. I was going to bring them all back to our guest bedroom in our house. And I also knew I was going to have to include her in the story, include Bonnie, because the story of the documents release and also the preservation of these documents and the fact that basically the only reason you're hearing this story now for the first time is because a woman in Florida had the courage and the perspicacity and the foresight to save this stuff for this long and hand it off to someone who would know what to do with it. And man, I did. I mean, and the only reason I did is because I come from a journalism, Sherlock Holmes oriented skill set. I know how to be a good truffle pick. I know how to go through documents. I know how to pull apart censorship. I love doing that stuff. And so that was basically the basis of how I tackled the book. I then lived with an archive for 2 years of de-censorship, or me going line by line through these transcripts, undoing, and then I would compare Bonnie Stark's papers to digital photographs that I'd taken of the entire state of Florida, the official archive in Tallahassee. I'd collate and compare them, and then since the censorship was different, in 75% of the cases, right, the redaction, the mutilation dropped away, and I could just see what the history was and what the document said. And that got to be really fun. recovering a story that the authorities didn't want you to know. Oh, it's like, it's a really fun thing to do. But it was 2 years of doing just that before I had enough, like a greedy gold mound of my narrative mana to then start writing the book, despite anything I told my publisher about how the book was progressing. Like, a sentence didn't get written until 3 years into this.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, that it's so exciting. Like, that must just be kind of a journalistic dream to find all that evidence. I mean, there's a story in itself, right? You searching for the evidence, and it's hidden, and then you find it, and it all opens up. Talk to us a little bit about the guy's name, who the committee's named after, Charley Johns. Yeah. Tell us about this guy.
Yeah, Charley Johns was a strident segregationist and a Southern Dixiecrat, like old school Democrat state senator, who had been basically stage managed. He was a old school, long-term man of the Senate who had organized the Dixie segregationist wing of North Florida, which is where most of the population was pre-World War II, and also where all the legislative lines were drawn. He orchestrated with them a group cabal where they all took a blood oath, and they decided to become pork chopper senators, they called themselves, and the goal of being a pork chopper was to preserve segregation by preventing redistricting. And it was the most radical form of regional gerrymandering I've ever seen. So Charley Johns would be elected, oftentimes running uncontested, by 20,000 voters from his two tiny North Florida county districts. And he'd have the same seat in the state Senate that one state senator from Miami-Dade County would have to get 500,000 votes to get. And so, and Charley Johns was the man orchestrating and preserving this heist of power in a state that was gaining a lot of money and a lot of population post-World War II. A lot of exciting things were happening. Like, everyone wanted a taste of that frozen concentrated orange juice. Miami and Tampa are booming. Famous writers are coming in. Kerouac's in Orlando. Elizabeth Bishop's in Key West. Rockets are flying off Cape. It's an exciting place. And then you have this Moonlight and Magnolias racist state government where the song is the old Sewanee River talking about darkies of the old plantation. It's like, it's crazy. And those are the people benefiting financially, and those people are benefiting because of Charley Johns. So what Charley Johns did, he'd stage managed the inheritance of the governorship in the early 1950s from a sick man, then lost it because he could never win a free and fair election. He was very bitter that he'd gotten kicked out of the governor's mansion, where he was called acting governor for a span of time because he happened to be Senate president when this other guy got sick. And then he tried to figure out, using constitutional loopholes, how can I use the most racist state constitution ever constructed, which is Florida's 1885 constitution that brought down Reconstruction in Florida and reinstilled basically re-empowered radical white home rule and kicked all the Republicans out and all the black representation out. And he figured out, he knew how do I use the loopholes to basically give myself a role where I have more power than the governorship, but only still being a senator. So when he decided, basically utilizing all sorts of parliamentary tricks to, in 1956, start this committee that he told white Floridians was necessary to protect them from the dangers of an integration effort that was happening in the state capital called the Tallahassee bus boycott, which was Florida's version of the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was happening right literally feet away from where the segregationist senators were meeting in session. And so they were irked. They couldn't believe the gall of these black leaders refusing to ride the buses until they could be side by side white men and women. They couldn't believe it. And so Charley Johns used hyped public sentiment around that to basically crown himself king of Florida. His committee, the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, he took chairmanship, and what he began to perpetrate became so notorious that they gave it the nickname after his last name. They called it the Johns Committee, which I got chills when I first heard. But he could use legislative power to then usurp law enforcement portions of the executive branch. So basically, he had cops working for him that should have been under the governor's authority, but he took them. And then you could also do work of the judiciary by being able to tell people, getting them under oath in open hearings or in private interrogations, saying that you committed perjury, or he could just find you in contempt of the Johns Committee, and then they would have to pursue that charge through the courts. And he was probably in his day the most powerful man in Florida, and feared, incredibly so, by anyone who was viewed as his opposition. By his friends, they loved him. So Charley Johns had all sorts of skills too. He had the parliamentary gifts of like a Mitch McConnell. He had the name recognition, memory capacity of like George W. Bush. He could remember anyone upon elephantine memory. He could remember anyone upon first introduction. He had the glad-handing skills of like a 1992 Clinton, young Clinton. So he could Charley Johns' greatest enemy in the Senate once says, "Charley Johns is the most charming man I've ever met. I have to remind myself that I hate him." So he could confound and trick people through his presence and his chumminess. And also he had the sort of revenge-seeking capacity and also the tendency to refer to himself in the third person. As our current president, he was the sort of guy that, Charley Johns is against winter racketeers in Florida. Charley Johns is that. That's not what Charley Johns said. And he's Charley Johns talking about Charley Johns. So he sort of pioneered this a kind of personality politics and also a style of Tallahassee politics that really planted toxic seeds that are the reason why once a decade, basically a new cycle in social panic will sprout from Florida, incubate, become part of the culture war, and then wash across our country in a mad panic that will claim that, a little bit of persecution of weirdos, however they define it, will, protect innocent whites from a moral hellscape. He's the source of this. And the greatest gift that, the devil ever pulled, to reference the usual suspects in Kaiser Soze, was he perfectly plotted his own retreat, too. In 1965, he held on to power so long, so strongly that he brought down the old state of Florida government. They had to scrap their constitution and start anew. He lost his Senate seat the instant that they basically undid the gerrymander so that he would have to have an equal number of voters sending him to office as in other districts, which is never going to work for him. He could never figure out how to win that kind of election. And he sealed the records and kept them perfectly out of public review all the way up to the day he died in the late 80s, early 1990s. But the Johnsian legacy is massive. And what he did as part of the Johns Committee needs to be known because it reflects the fact that I think a lot of these social panics that come out of Florida, DeSantisism is just the latest, are just recirculating old ideas that generated actually from a much more brilliant and maniacal human being that found a way to actually make himself a kind of emperor of a domain in a way that was, according to the at least letter of the state constitution for its time, legal. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, it's one thing with Charley Johns and a lot of the other guys you mentioned, DeSantis among them. Sometimes I can't tell if they really buy their ideology or whether it is even more cynical than that, and it's really just about consolidation of wealth. Do you have a sense of where Johns falls on that?
Johns was a strident segregationist, so that means he did believe in superiority of the races. And for example, the greatest black ally he had tended to be there were black servants at the Florida governor's mansion. Most of them, and someone could write a book about this, most of them were convicted murderers who'd gotten out of state prison on parole and then were meant to heal themselves by serving Florida white elites. They would also occasionally give advice. He thought that was the proper role of a black man, not Father Theodore Gibson, president of the Miami branch of the Florida NAACP, who's suing suing to desegregate the schools. Not members of the Tallahassee Intercivic Council, who are doing a bus boycott to try to integrate public transit. That offended him greatly. And then sexually, he was offended by homosexuality and queerness. So he had a very naive sexual sense. He looked like a Baptist deacon. He was a Southern Baptist. He was really into the Revised Standard Version Bible that had come out in 1946 was the first that was really picked up by Southern Baptists, which was the first English language translation of a Bible to include the late 1800s German word homosexual in a Leviticus context. So Charley took and ran with that stuff, and he did find them offensive, and he did want to repress them. But more than that, so I guess it's yes in both. More than that, he wanted to preserve his financial advantage and also his access to no-bid government contracts and things like that. For example, Charley Johns had an insurance company that would get essentially no-bid contracts with state agencies like the Fish and Wildlife, or, for example, he issued the insurance contracts for the state prison Rayford that was in his home district. I mean, he did this even after he got kicked out of the Senate. I just kept going. Also, he had an ice company, pre-air conditioning in Florida, which is like selling heating oil in Alaska. I mean, it gets it's as hot as it is in New Orleans for me right now. It's even hotter in Florida in the summer. That was a reason that pre-World War II, a lot of settlement in the state had not gone past Ocala. Orlando was still going to, a post-World War II boom situation. And so basically he had a handshake deal to sell all the ice at the University of Florida football games. And this was considered not spoils, but part of your right as a good old boy who has access to power. And so he would never want to give that up. He came from an upbringing where basically his father had died at a young age. He had been a county sheriff who'd been murdered in a suspicious crime. And his brother Markley had raised him, and his family had a temporary situation where they were impoverished in the midst of Depression years, and he sort of carried that with him his whole life. So even after he was a tremendously rich man, he could only think back to the years when he was younger and basically didn't have a father. He was self-pitying, as you can find many white supremacists are. They think they're actually disempowered in a society that advantages them at every turn. Oh, Charley Johns was also a railroad conductor. In the midst of they were allowed to have all these jobs. It seems like these segregated guys. And he didn't actually get the conductor position until he got elected senator. Then they made him a conductor and let him drive the train. But anyway, so when he started on the railroad, he basically, wherever he was, the lowest rung white was always higher than the highest rung black. Throughout the train system. That was the world he grew up living in, and that was what he thought was the proper order of things. So he was a believer in apartheid, and in the way that he thought that was the best way to organize society, because it helped men like him and his friends do well. And I think he also thought that it was his job to make sure people that weren't him and not his friends not do well. And I think DeSantis is on that same train of where Florida had probably for a certain span, the late 60s, 70s, 80s, they had the new constitution, the creation of sunshine laws, the sort of liberalism in government in Florida, believe it or not, that existed in state government in Florida, and that sort of flourished for a span of time, but then was beaten back by sort of more latent tendencies that had to do with what Tallahassee politics likes. And eventually, I think by the 90s, 2000s, with the rise of Jeb Bush, the anti-gay adoption initiative stuff, and now DeSantisism, we're sort of back to old school Florida politics calling the shots. And so that's the reason why DeSantis thinks of himself as a regular guy. He said, he's from this really rich suburb area of like Tampa, St. Pete area, but he says, I have more to do with Ohio, Pennsylvania. I'm just a regular. Basically, he's saying like, this is what pork choppers who were rich, like Charley Johns would say. Charley Johns would be like, he'd be like, I eat my steaks with ketchup, and he would pretend to be like, couldn't say the word founding fathers. He'd say, I love the founding fathers. And then this guy ran an insurance company where he wrote his own actuarial formulas. That's hard math, okay? Like, this guy is hiding a calculating mind. And just in that same way, too, DeSantis is quite brilliant. He knows how to play, he knows how to tap zeitgeist. He knows how to hype up and sort of hoist an enemy. And he also knows what tricks work involving, like, we need to teach people the right kind of history in Florida, not AP African-American history, which is going to make them hate their state, right? But that sentiment was echoed in Charley Johns' time when they said, we need to teach an Americanism versus communism course, so that these kids growing up aren't being made by these fancy liberal professors and teachers. They're not reading Marx. They need to know the danger. They need to know good Mercanism. And so, basically, a lot of these notions, just basically that you can kind of find them all in a big Florida Tallahassee Powerball machine, and you can pick them out like gumballs, and they all seem to still be effective because they all play on fears of the white base that has never really gotten over the emotional hangover and the legacy of just how brutal racial violence and racial carnage was to preserve the apartheid system for years and years.
Well, there you go. We know now. So, listen, where do people find you? The book's available everywhere. Do you have social media? Do you have a website? Where do they find Bob?
I mean, I'm usually on a street corner, so you can just...
Oh, okay. What corner are you on today?
No, you could find me on, I'm not on Twitter anymore because it got mean and weird. And not in a good internet way, like where, there's good internet weird, but like that's funny, but like, I mean, just mean. So I'm on Instagram at wordbobby, WORDBOBBY. The reason I'm that is because no one could spell my last name. My childhood best friend struggles to spell my last name. I've accepted that human beings just can't do this. This is just part of my life. I'm also on Blue Sky at wordbobby, WORDBOBBY. And then, you can get to my website from either place, actually, through like a little link tree thing. I think those are the best ways to get to me. And then you can find my book, American Scare, Florida's Hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives, wherever books are sold. But I prefer, I want to say, I sincerely prefer if you go to like an indie bookstore seller or a queer bookstore if you're interested to purchase this. Don't give money to the evil empire. Don't put money in the pocket of that guy that just got married in Venice. He doesn't need it. Trust me, he does not need it. So, and I hope that's not controversial to say, but like, please, literary culture is built up and supported by the indie book selling operation and the redemptive power of the hand sell for human beings. So please support your local indie bookstore, and that would be the best place for you to get American Scare.
Well, there you have it. You heard it from the author himself. So there you go. That's where you get it. American Scare. It's Florida's Hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives. Robert W. Fieseler. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.